Okay. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the second annual George Padmore Institute lecture. My name's Rob Waters, and I teach here in the Department of History. I'm going to get the administrative stuff out of the way first, so that we can get on to the more interesting part of proceedings. So firstly, the toilets, should anyone need them, are just straight outside that door there. The fire exits are at the top of both of the stairs and then also out that door as well. And we don't have any planned fire alarms and we don't plan to have a fire, so if it goes off, that's real. So we're delighted to be now on the second year of this partnership between the George Padmore Institute and the Department of History here at Queen Mary. And this year is the second lecture. You can find the film of the first lecture, the inaugural lecture last year by Professor David Scott on YouTube, and that was a lecture on Walter Rodney and the Caribbean intellectual tradition, a theme that we'll be returning to again this evening. Before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I want to invite Roxy Harris, who's the chair of the George Padmore Institute, to say a few words about the George Padmore Institute. Thanks.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. We very much welcome this partnership with this department in Queen Mary. Want to give thanks to Chris Moffat and Rob Waters and other colleagues for facilitating this evening. Just want to say a couple of words about what the George Padmore Institute is, and those of you interested in history, radical history, Caribbean history, etc., will know of or may have heard of George Padmore. Very under-researched and underwritten about, although somebody here has done a biography of him. But it's a particular tradition in the Caribbean that our founder, John LaRose, really belonged to, which is a radical tradition of the left, anti-imperialist, anti-racist, and for equality and social justice for all people. The George Padmore Institute was set up in 1991 out of a group of cultural and political activists who'd made many, many important interventions in Black and Brown Britain's history around things like police corruption and violence against Black people, on the question of education for Black pupils, but also in culture, poetry, literature, publishing, etc. And in 1991, we decided to set up the George Padmore Institute to document all those struggles. So we set out an archive, and the archive is like, we call it an activist archive. In other words, it's not just random artifacts collected, it's the documents that came out of the struggles from the 1950s onwards. We also publish, and we also have events, talks, educational things like this. For anybody who's interested, please Google George Padmore Institute. You'll find our website, and you'll find lots of stuff to look at online, apart from the list of all the archive documents. But you'll also find lots of recordings, videos, and etc. to look at. So thank you very much for coming. Very much look forward to the talk. Hope you have a good evening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Roxy. And it's an honour to welcome everybody here to Queen Mary this evening. I've got a couple of thank yous as well. I want to say thank you to our head of department, Emma Griffin, for continuing to support this partnership, and also thank you to Dr. Chris Moffat, who is also a member of teaching staff here at Queen Mary in the Department of History, also a trustee of the George Padmore Institute and the organising force behind tonight's event. And I want to welcome also our speaker for this evening, Matthew J. Smith, who's Professor of History at the University College London. At University College London, Professor Smith is the director of the Centre for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery, and that's the UK's foremost public history centre for research on the history of British slavery and its aftermath. It's a resource that I'm sure many of us will be familiar with. I've used the resource many times in my own teaching. Professor Smith was appointed as director of the centre in 2020. Prior to that, he worked at the University of West Indies, Mona in Jamaica, where he was Professor of Caribbean History. He's published widely on Caribbean history and is a specialist on the history of Haiti and Jamaica. And he's currently writing a social history of Jamaican popular music. This evening, Professor Smith will be talking about the Jamaican labour activist, journalist, Marxist and historian Frank Hill, and as he has it in the title to the talk, the creation story of Jamaica. He will speak for roughly 50 minutes and then we'll have time at the end for questions as well. So welcome, Professor Smith. Thank you.
Good evening, my friends. When he died in the summer of 1980, a stream of considered remembrances made its descent on the Jamaican media in praise of Frank Hill. The tributes filled newspaper columns, letters, front pages, and editorials for nearly a week. Council and government meetings across Jamaica opened with a moment of silence in respect of him. Words he had used so often to describe Jamaica's builders like Marcus Garvey, who he held in greatest esteem, Paul Bogle and Sam Sharp, were being used to talk about Frank Hill. Great, revolutionary, pioneer, brilliant, one of the founding fathers of the government, of the self-government movement in Jamaica. Original, courageous, selfless. An editorial in the leading daily pulled all of these thoughts together with the following. The death of Mr. Frank Hill CD in his 70th year brings to an end a life of dedication lived through the most crucial years in the evolution of the Jamaican nation. Before the emergence of Norman Manley and Alexander Bustamante on the national scene, Frank Hill was working with others to articulate ideas of Jamaican nationhood. From early, he set his mind and efforts towards the achievement by his country and its people of the dignity and respect which he knew was not possible in a colonial situation, end quote. The evening paper, The Star, offered a similar take that elevated his intellectual importance to the making of modern Jamaica even more. Quote, "It is not too much to say that his thinking had a great influence on the path Jamaica has taken since 1938, end quote. Sylvia Wynter, the Jamaican theorist, playwright, and critic, then at Stanford University, serialized her tribute to Frank Hill, one of her great personal mentors, because his role and place in Jamaican thought and history was too great to be summed up in 500 words. She called him, quote, an indigenous intellectual, the brilliant outsider, who earned a prominent place in any Jamaican Hall of Fame for his service and inspiration of a new Jamaican political thought. John Hearn, the novelist and journalist, was poetic in his tribute to Hill. Men like Frank Hill gave us the hard surfaces of their personalities against which we sharpened ourselves. What Frank Hill did to earn this much admiration was not easy to decipher. He was not a parliamentarian. He had no chiseled legend capsulated in anniversary pamphlets. His face never graced currency like the other founding fathers who built their lives working in the same soil. There were no portraits of Frank Hill in classrooms or tax offices. His ideas and polished quotes, birthed in militant Marxism of the 1930s, were not repeated on bunting at political meetings or party conferences. To appreciate Frank Hill's colossal impact on Jamaican thought and nationalism, you have to look at the fractals that made the composite picture. The official tributes included roles: trade unionist, broadcaster, journalist, chair of the National Trust, co-founder and first elected member of the People's National Party, nationalist. It was in the words of those touched by Hill's obsessive labors as a nation builder that the picture begins to sharpen and the contributions become visible. 6 of the island's trade unions came together to pen a moving tribute to Hill's work in the labor movement that suggested the depth of his dedication to Jamaica's popular classes. They remembered him for his speeches to the dock workers and his treks deep into the banana and cane plantations to meet with workers and spending hours learning from them as much as helping them organize for their rights. That was in the uneasy years of the late 30s, when still a 20-something, he, along with his gifted and extraordinary brother Ken, who among other achievements served as a leader of the Jamaican delegation that came to the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester, co-organized, of course, by George Padmore, and gave a speech at that meeting that Padmore regarded as one of the best moments of the Congress. Ken and Frank worked shoulder to shoulder as the two bright architects of the trade union movement in Jamaica. Ken's tribute to Frank on his death was a statement that in its brevity contained so much potency in narrating their joint story of hard graft in making an organization for workers' rights on barren fields. And this is what Ken Hill said of his brother. We struggled together, we sacrificed together, we were gratified together. The unions who came together on Frank's death hailed him for his, quote, massive intellectual force and sheer dedication, unpolluted by personal ambitions. Some recalled Hill's patient and effective negotiations on behalf of 60,000 sugar workers in the celebrated negotiations of the early 50s, one of the biggest union victories in Jamaica at the time. A union man, Lionel Lynch, who worked with Frank Hill in the 40s before migrating to Birmingham, wrote a letter from Aston recalling Hill's influence on labor militants. He recalled Frank Hill setting up the Workers' Education League at a place on Temple Lane in downtown Kingston, which was nicknamed the Kremlin. This was where Hill lectured on the strategies of organization and protest. And it was when Frank Hill, who was an expert pamphleteer with a knack for concise prose, related the inequities of working conditions with a larger project of foreign capital and control since slavery that people became more aware of him. Lynch remembered the great sacrifice and personal danger Hill put himself in with the colonial authorities by doing this work, which included lending books, pamphlets, and notes on Union history, which became the foundational education for future Union leaders. The Frank Hill he remembered was, quote, a young man of vision and great knowledge, head and shoulders above many of those who used to be toying with politics and trade unionism in those hectic days of the hungry 1930s to 50s. The part of Frank Hill's life which overshadows the other sides of the prison, whenever his name is recalled today, was his public expulsion with his brother Ken, along with Richard Hart and Arthur Henry from the PNP at a tumultuous party conference in 1952 over allegations that they were involved in a communist plot to overthrow the government. It was at the time especially piercing because the Hill brothers and O.T. Fairclough, another hard toiler and organizer of Caribbean anti-colonialism, so little remembered today, in 1937 visited Norman Manley at his law offices and tried to persuade Manley to lead and form a political party. And they were disappointed when Manley told them that in his view, Jamaica's problems were social, not political. It would take the labor rising of 1938 to convince Manley and activate the plan that Frank Hill had been working out from earlier. The expulsion had to be personally hurtful, but it did not deter Frank or Ken Hill. And as much as the story has become a point of celebration among later leftists who hail Frank for his bravery, it was something he seldom spoke of or wrote about in the decades that followed. He preferred instead to focus on the many other aspects of his era, which he believed were the real substance of what he called Jamaica's, quote, painful search for self-identity. Then there were those who remembered Frank Hill for his contribution to the arts. Early on in his life, he supported the Jamaican theatre movement, and in 1943 even penned a one-act play called The Betrayal. His high-profile role in the 60s as chairman of the Institute of Jamaica and the National Trust, a post he held for a decade, made him one of the most public figures in Jamaican cultural life in the crucial first decade of Jamaican independence. It was in this capacity that Hill moved for Desmond Decker, one of reggae's first breakthrough performers, to be given a prestigious Musgrave Medal in 1970, becoming the first musician-singer ever to receive it. We must remember this was at a time when the Jamaican establishment were holding their breath that this loud atonal music from Kingston's ghettos would be a passing fad. All these accolades, all these sacrifices and ground laying are glints of the career and legacy of Frank Hill. None of the tributes mentioned the father, who with his devoted and independent-minded wife, Monica, raised 6 children who were part of a large family of intellectuals and early black middle-class Jamaicans. They did not hint at the deep personal friendship Frank Hill had with Paul Robeson, who Hill met in 1945 on a visit to New York, and the circumstances of their meeting says something else about Frank Hill. He attended a performance of Othello, and so transported by Robeson's performance, went backstage to thank him, then ended up speaking with the legend for well over an hour on politics, Marxism, black culture, and world events. They exchanged details and maintained a decades-long friendship, heightened when Robeson visited Jamaica in 1948 on the invitation of Frank's younger brother Stephen, a key figure in the development of Jamaican popular music, and was given a tour of the island by Frank Hill, who coaxed Paul Robeson to give a free performance for high school girls in Montego Bay. Just imagine, that must have been a thrill. The tributes to Frank Hill mentioned, but could not possibly capture all of the tremendous and lifelong work he did as a newspaperman. He was co-founder of the left paper Public Opinion, a weekly, and as editor was responsible for some of that paper's legendary editorials against British colonialism, including Roger Mays's famous piece, Now We Know, for which Mays was locked up. The newspaper work coursed steadily through his veins from the time he could walk. Frank Hill's father, Stephen Hill, was an editor of the Daily Gleaner, so Frank grew up with a firm respect for the power of words and the discipline of getting them right, from idea to final proof. He once called the sound of an old printer cranking out the first copy of a newspaper the sweetest song in the world. Frank Hill's love for writing was nourished when, as a high schooler at St. George's College, he edited the student paper, The Blue and the White. By the years of his political maturity in the unions and the PNP, he was responsible for the editing of the major workers' paper, The Masses, and even had his own daily paper for a while, the Montego Bay Times. In his capacity as a newspaper person, he got to travel widely. He was the leading Caribbean correspondent at the founding of the United Nations in 1945. He worked and briefly lived in Trinidad during the Federation years of the late 50s, which he covered. He had a weekly column in the Haitian paper, Haiti Sun, in the early part of that decade, and visited Haiti as part of that work. And he was a Caribbean correspondent for the legendary British liberal paper of the 50s, News Chronicle, before it was bought, hold your breath, by the Daily Mail in 1960. One of his most famous pieces was written in 1955, the 300th anniversary of British colonialism in Jamaica, which was also the year that the 20,000th Jamaican person migrated to the UK. Hill traveled from Kingston to London with that Jamaican migrant and wrote a first-hand report of the journey and the wave of Caribbean migration to the UK. He was never going to count himself among them. On an early trip to London for a trade union conference in 1951, he wrote that the place was cold and distant. Buckingham Palace looked more like a tomb than a palace. The deeply anti-colonial Hill was not cheered by his meetings with members of the socialist movement, whose ideology paralleled his own. He assented to the cynical conclusion of a colleague that said, quote, "In Britain, scratch the skin of a socialist and you will find he is still British," end quote. Frank Hill's destiny was always to be in the Caribbean, an unswerving commitment to see the back of British imperial rule there, and then to start the activation of a deeper process of Caribbean self-direction. That was the holding cord of all his written work, and with a rigid discipline, he went wherever he needed to be to study the colonial condition and to gain a wide-angle view of its alternatives. Frank Hill would go to Coronation Market in downtown Kingston in the early 60s to attend meetings organized by Rastafari elders from the nearby Bacco Wall community to better understand their position on post-colonialism. And, years later, he would sit with Queen Elizabeth II and over a gin and tonic get her perspective on the same question. The persons who understood the weight of what he did and how he did it were those in the same trade who had come up in a world and age that Frank Hill had helped shape. 2 days after Frank Hill's death, the celebrated South African journalist and friend of Padmore, Peter Abrams, spoke on the Jamaican radio at length on the greatness of Frank Hill. He recalled being a teenager in South Africa when he first read about Frank Hill in something written by George Padmore. He thanked Padmore for making the connection that would mean even more to Abrams when he later came to live in Jamaica and grew close to Frank Hill, seeing up close how much he gave to his craft and how completely he believed in the concept of an independent Jamaica. Frank Hill, Peter Abrams, George Padmore were part of a generation of black thinkers and activists who ripped away the crepe thrown so lithely over colonialism's face. They did not choose easy paths. In Hill's case, he could have leveraged his notice, acclaim, and talent for a university chair, or settled in a comfortable existence as a politician, but he never chose to. Every move, every award, he himself would receive several before his passing. He received a Musgrave Award in 1975 and also became Commander of Distinction in Jamaica as well shortly after. Every award seemed to be regarded as another start rather than an end. It was a regard of himself and his work arrived at through an endless quest for black self-knowledge. It was John Hearne, whose own famous career was inspired by Hill, who caught the meaning of Hill's collective work when he, in his tribute to Frank, concluded, quote, "It is difficult to describe to the younger people of 1980 the sort of trust and sense of exhilaration that Frank Hill's generation created among the young over 40 years ago. Frank Hill's generation fashioned and inspired a sense of equal pioneering risk, literally out of nothing but their remarkable courage and character." Frank Hill published only one book in his life, an edited collection of Bustamante's letters of the 1930s. It came out late when his health was deteriorating, and so he could not follow up on it. It is partly for this reason that his contributions to the Caribbean anti-colonial movement and radical black Caribbean thought have slipped from notice. To know them and recover something of his intellectual ideas, we must go to what he said and thought in writings scattered across personal collections and newspapers stored in libraries from London to Kingston and back. In a rare personal insight into how he saw himself, he wrote the following in 1963. "You've heard me variously described as a journalist and a radio commentator. I really don't answer to those snobbish descriptions. I prefer to think of myself merely as a reporter. A reporter tells you what happened and when and where it happened. That's ordinary straight news reporting. But I seek to add a new dimension to this what, when, and where. My job is to find out what happened or is likely to happen, and just as important, to tell you why it happened." End quote. It gets closer to the reality of who Hill was if he is also seen as a Caribbean writer of the same generation of other Caribbean writers of the 1930s to the 60s, who he knew and corresponded with. They read Frank Hill assiduously, and he gave them so much to read. Frank Hill was prolific. He wrote constantly and fluidly, on the back of matchboxes during boring lectures. In his ever-present writer's journal and on drafts and printed pages, his marginalia indicated a mind that was constantly busy. Most days of his adult life were marked by the ink stains on his fingers of ribbon cartridges that came from the ritual of smoking his pipe in tight concentration as he submitted himself to what he once called the tyranny of the typewriter. He absorbed his society, keeping his loved ones close and his dictionary closer. He lived with words, and like the scholar, tried to find the right ones to express the mood, and like the novelist, searched for the emotion in the history. A gathering of Hill's writings in the newspapers, his letters, and also especially in his radio commentaries, brings back the anti-colonial thinker, whose outsized contributions to Jamaican national development and Caribbean post-colonial thought made him one of the most recognized voices of his generation. It was in his radio broadcasts that Frank Hill most came alive. From around 1960, he had a 5-day-a-week, 5-minute commentary on RGR, Radio Jamaica, then one of only 2 radio stations in the island. The program, As I See It, which matriculated into others, was broadcast every evening from 6:10 to 6:15, right after the news. It ran throughout the 60s and into the 70s. It cannot be overstated how central Frank Hill's work and voice were to Jamaica in this critical period of its coming as a nation. For when Frank Hill spoke on radio, it was not the opinions of the armchair commentator. What Jamaicans who religiously tuned in across the 14 parishes received were the words and thoughts of a person who had already earned his place of influence as a nation builder at a time when the engineers of the structure of the new Jamaica were still figuring out how to do the job they were given. Frank Hill was heard by privileged and poor alike, and so his views and that chipping away at orthodoxies had more reach and influence than any book he might have published. Each evening, people tuned in for his signature opening, "Good evening, my friends," through to his more famous closing tag, "Walk good, my friends," which became so synonymous with him that there are some from that generation of the 60s who utter it immediately whenever they hear his name as if it were an official title. He became such a respected voice that by the late 60s he was running 2 other weekly programs, Frankly Speaking and Historically Speaking. When his numerous public lectures and articles are joined up with the excellent record of his broadcasts, his voice comes back to us. All of Frank Hill's writings and broadcasts were bound up by a singular purpose, to cut down what he often called the Babel, an obscuring tower of empty debates, colonial myths, and half-truths on empire, race, and black history. As he said on the eve of independence, quote, "The comfortable myths and illusions that we carried tolerantly in our colonial days cannot serve us in independence." He was seeking, he said, to find the truth of a matter. And as airy as that might seem to us today in 2026, we must remember that the raison d'etre of colonialism was to project an exterior image of the Caribbean believed with devotion by Caribbean people themselves with the same adherence they had to the book of Genesis. Hill was impatient with the uneven conclusions on Jamaica written by outsiders, though he was ready to celebrate them if he believed they struck at a hidden contradiction. And the self-serving arguments of politicians were also upsetting to him, many of whom, we should note, he counted among his friends. In a late 60s broadcast, he reminded his audience that he could criticize the politicians who were running Jamaica because in 1938 he was having a drink in a downtown bar with Bustamante when the workers showed up to ask them to help with the strike and took Bustamante out of that bar and into history. And he was there beside Norman Manley that same year at the Ward Theatre when the PNP was born. And he helped Manley with that first major speech that launched his political fame. These long relationships did not prevent him from the cutting assessments of these leaders, nor prevent him from a vigorous public campaign to make both Manley and Bustamante national heroes. As a reporter, he said, "I maintain a ceaseless Cold War with the politicians, for to me, the politician is only an instrument of the sovereignty of the people, and the people can only exercise that sovereignty properly when they know the truth." A digest of Frank Hill's thoughts on the making of Jamaica produces not so much an alternative narrative of decolonization, which we should acknowledge Hill was partly responsible for drafting, but a different understanding of it. One that strips away the surface coats to reveal the original intention of the creators of modern Jamaica. From what has been said so far, it is unsurprising that one of Hill's great preoccupations was colonialism, and a particular British form of colonialism. His assertive role in the anti-colonial movement in Jamaica led to his detention with Ken, Hart, and Henry at Up Park Camp for 4 months from October 1942 for what were called subversive articles in their periodical The Masses. The experience strengthened his resolve to press harder over the next 15 years towards decolonization. The day of his release, he was interviewed briefly, and rather than submitting to the conventions of stating how glad he was to be freed, he spoke of the tremendous work that lay ahead of Jamaica. Hill's political ideas on colonialism only developed further from there. At the start of the 1960s, he was at the forefront of the Jamaican campaigns to end British rule. Speaking in 1961, he said, quote, "The things we have a lot of, sunshine and loud chatter and babies, and a great deal of poverty. But there's one thing we haven't got much of, and that is time. We're short of time. Time is running out. We need independence at the earliest possible moment, and we haven't got much time left. The urgency was not so much about establishing Jamaican sovereignty and the need to address social challenges on independent terms. It was more psychological. He looked to Africa and Ghana's independence and the massive infusion of black pride it produced and wanted the same thing for his country. As he wrote at the end of the 50s, quote, Nkrumah leads up a movement started by the great American educator Du Bois and assisted by the great West Indian George Padmore, and he throws the whole weight of a nation's power, the state of Ghana, behind that movement in an effort to correct the distorted images, end quote. It was the force of that movement that Hill desired for Jamaica. He feared that the longer deliberations and debates dragged on, the further the Caribbean was moving from the destiny that Africa was realizing. 307 years of continual British rule had damaged Jamaican black identity, and the repair of that in the 60s was something he spent a great deal of time addressing in his writings and radio broadcasts. It was his position to stir this process from stage left rather than in the spotlight in those curving years from West Indian Federation in 1958 to its collapse after the Jamaican referendum in 1961. Quite contrary to others from the 30s who joined the ranks of representative politics, Hill believed that the men and women who led the political struggle since 1938 had to see independence through and then recede. Here is his blunt position on the wake of the referendum vote of 1961, which ended the Federation dream. Quote, this is how I see it. We're moving from a colonial society into an independent status. Most people acknowledge this transition without grasping its implications. But one thing has to be clearly understood. People who have had their characters formed by a colonial society with its habits of looking outward, outside their own shores for guidance and direction, and a lead to new effort cannot be fully trusted to bear, and lead the new effort cannot be fully trusted to bear the new strains demanded by independence, where they have to look inwards to their own strengths and rely exclusively on their own efforts. Old habits die hard, and old modes of thought linger on long after their usefulness. And that is why, by and large, I regard anybody over 45 today as being a weak link in the social chain of the new independent Jamaica we are setting out to build from now on. In fact, the only significant function of persons like me who have passed the half-century mark is perhaps to stretch a restraining hand on those who may seek to go faster than our ripe experience thinks wise or expedient, end quote. Now, this view bears comment. It has been a focus on the scholarship on Jamaican independence, written at least since the 1970s and Louis Lindsay's seminal essay, The Myth of Independence, to underscore the personal desires for power of a political elite that saw independence as a way to forge their own legacies. Frank Hill was making this point at the very moment of independence. In Jamaica of the 60s, he once wrote, quote, political power is the spur to conservatism, since the road to power winds through hundreds of ballot boxes. The vision of the political class was led in the main by lighter-skinned men caught between a want for self-governance and cultivated expectations, stated or not, that it should be framed within a British mold. This internal conflict nourished the harsh political battles that followed and depressed the national consciousness, so that, as Lindsay and George Beckford famously argued, old symbols were merely replaced by new ones with little interrogation, replacing God Save the Queen with the national anthem in cinemas and theatres, turning Empire Day into Labour Day, and so on. Frank Hill was addressing these contradictions at the moment of their making, and he was making his discomfort known to the entire island on the airwaves. He sat in the gallery of Gordon House, the Jamaican Parliament, in October 1961 for the opening debate on the form of the Jamaican Constitution. In his broadcast on the radio the following evening, he picked up on the paradoxes. Quote, yesterday, Manley formally started the wheels moving for the last haul towards freedom. This should have been a historic debate filled with stirring declarations of faith, sustained and hoped and realized, and a clear confidence in the future ahead of us. Instead, I found the whole exercise dispiriting. The government benches were awed by the memory of their defeat in the referendum, and not even the thought that the long road they had hoed since 1938 was bringing them to journey's end could soften the tight band that were around their mouths, end quote. He was more troubled by the scene outside the Parliament. Hundreds of people had gathered on Duke Street chanting, "Freedom, freedom." And at the Ward Theatre, the Garveyite PPP, People's Progressive Party under Millard Johnson, held a rally. And at both scenes, the crowds faced police battalions in riot gear. It all disturbed Hill and contributed to what he called an air of defeatism. But whatever misgivings Hill had over the procedural aspects of constitutional self-government, he believed colonialism and its core racial prejudice would take a great collective effort to overcome. The British system, he maintained, exposed this prejudice toward Caribbean people, all the more obviously in their treatment of black communities in the UK. The national outcry over the proposal, then implementation of the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act, limiting the number of Caribbean people, especially Jamaicans and Trinidadians, to migrate to the United Kingdom, was taken by Jamaican commentators as vindication of what Frank Hill and others had been saying since the mid-30s. In a broadcast on the subject of migration to England, this is what he had to say about the bill. Quote, "The first reaction is that the bar on migrants is being inspired by racial prejudice. And people here," that's in Jamaica, "make the charge as if they've just discovered a new phenomenon. Yet the British have been notorious for centuries as among the most prejudiced nationals in the world. Only their prejudice has deep cultural roots. In cultural terms, the British live on the assumption that they are superior, more developed, more civilized than the rest of the world." End quote. And when the ban came into effect, Hill took to the radio with an intense comment that held in view the material reality of this prejudice and its cellular vestiges in the body politic of the post-colonial Caribbean. And this is what he said. "I have never been in any doubt that the dominating reason behind the drive to limit migration to Britain has been based upon racial discrimination against non-white races of the Commonwealth. In the British mind, the image of a West Indian is that of a Jamaican migrant, and there's no doubt what the shade of the skin is. The Anglo-Saxons may like black people as long as they are abstract masses that can be rationalized into philosophical principles of what ought to be. And the Anglo-Saxons may even be induced to take the black served up in small exotic doses. But once we live among them in respectable numbers, to compete for jobs and housing, they throw up reactions that show they haven't changed since Kipling's Victorian day when they regarded us as lesser breeds outside the law." The bill, the Commonwealth Bill, or also called the Kerr Bill, which Hill referred to as, quote, "skillful discrimination," made bare what was once thinly concealed. Here are his closing words on that radio broadcast. "This is a signal triumph for the real voice of Britain, the voice that insists on keeping Britain white. Now so much for vaunted British liberalism, whose image has been held up to us all these years as the model of all virtue and righteousness. Now the thin mirror has been cracked into a million pieces. We now know beyond any question how the dominant act in the Commonwealth regards us, lesser breeds of an alien culture against which rigid safeguards must be erected for fear that we pollute their cultural stream." The greater lesson for all of what he says there was to come for Jamaica in the next decade. After independence, Jamaica entered the community of nations in the Caribbean and Latin America, vulnerable to the global shifts of the demanding 60s. It was the era of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the acceleration of the US Civil Rights Movement, Haitian dictatorship under François Duvalier, the US invasion of the Dominican Republic, escalation in Vietnam, and African decolonization. The affront Caribbean leaders had to British immigration policy, justifiable as it was for Frank Hill less significant than figuring out how to prepare their young nations to live through the troubling 60s. What he called, quote, "the harsh breeze of realistic self-analysis that should stir whirlwinds of determination in the Caribbean were being avoided as the leaders of the region sought migration reform in Britain. If Jamaica was to be a self-determined nation, it had to look at itself more closely first and identify each inheritance of colonialism that seep through all social interactions. When Hill considered the British monarchy and its official presence in Jamaica, he found it absurd. In an account of a visit of the Queen Mother to Jamaica, he was critical of how in the moment of building new symbols of recognition, the island's leaders who aligned themselves with the Jamaicans, who resisted the grip of empire, were so accepting of keeping the monarchy in place. He spoke of the blind genuflection to her status by the Jamaicans who greeted her, women tripping over themselves in Dior gowns in awkward curtsies. He was even more expressive in another comment on the true ambition of independence. This is what he said, quote, "Most Jamaicans have an ambiguous attitude towards the British Queen, whom we accept as the Queen of Jamaica. We're drawn to the prestige of royalty, yet we'd rather if the gracious lady looked more like Lady Bustamante. The framers of our independence constitution in 1962 literally manacled us to the British crown. They laid it down that we were to have a monarchical form of government, and they so deeply entrenched this system that we could only change it and become a republic by having a referendum." End quote. This particular inheritance, fealty and admiration for the prestige of the royal family, coexisted with one of Hill's greatest meditations, which was race. Not a year after independence, he was invited to deliver a keynote lecture at the University of the West Indies on the theme Racial Integration in Jamaica. Given his stature, the lecture was attended by a large audience, including leaders of the Rastafari movement, such as Mortimer Plano, and members of the various black conscious organizations from Western Kingston. Hill wove 3 centuries of Jamaican history together with confident knowledge of social relations and their constraints to strip down the glimmer of national independence and put the island's racial problems as a living history. This is what he says, quote, "One achievement of the whites in their 3 centuries rule in Jamaica was the extent to which they succeeded in imprinting on the face of our society acceptance of their cultural patterns and customs. Their brainwashing of this society which they ruled was complete. A sense of self-contempt that reached into all non-white groups in one way or another created a white bias that distorts our society to this day." End quote. He routed a path to 1963 columned by external colonial racism on one side and internal color prejudice on the other. He broke open the illusion that independence, which then was only months old, birthed a unified sense of Jamaicanness. The cross of the past, he said, was too heavy to not have left scars on the island's back. He continued, "If everything worthwhile is to be associated with white, goodness, beauty, even God, and if the society as a whole accepts these standards without question, then you're condemning the non-white group in our society to a permanent and perpetual inferiority since they are inexorably outside the pale of whiteness. This is not a mortal weakness for the black majority of our people who eventually are bound to get over the sense of self-contempt that has been drilled into them through slavery and the post-emancipation period. But let's face it, the real problem lies with the light-skinned Jamaican group in power. Their problem of coming to terms with themselves. In world terms, they have to see themselves as quite nondescript, as a racial grouping that the world as a whole does not recognize. Despite their protestations to the contrary, they can't quite accept in their hearts the fact that a cold black man sits in King's house. I have no panacea for the racial integration of our society. I'm not sure what will work for certain. But if I were to hazard practical steps forward, I'd say put your money on education for the long range." Still a prognosis and a prescription that we still hear today. "Meantime, keep talking every day about our racial problems. That way we'll defeat those ostriches in our society who feel that last August we built one people out of many races with the framing of a pious aspiration." End quote. Hill's treatment of race as historic and present in the Jamaican condition guided much of his writing in the first 6 years of independence and also his broadcasts. He raised it continually on his weekly program. He framed racial problems as part of the carryover of colonialism that was actively being challenged by a younger generation. He was keen to raise in his work the social importance of Rastafari to a new understanding of black self-identity at a time when the elites and the states were bent on arresting the growth of the movement. This is what he said in a broadcast on the Rastafari movement. Quote, "Most people regard the Rastafarians as a lunatic fringe who believe the Ethiopian king is God and who want to be returned to Africa. And so most people look upon Rastafarianism as a cult that attracts only twisted, tortured souls. This is a superficial view that is inspired largely by guilt and fear, end quote. Now, Frank Hill had his own questions on the place of Rastafari in the future of Jamaica, but what he insisted on in the mid-60s was not the value of the movement, but how the responses to its spread, which verged on moral panic, was a sign of the divisions that were camouflaged by national symbols. The rejection of Rasta was, in his view, a rejection of the claims of poor urban Jamaicans and more of the need to confront the prejudices along racial and class lines in the new Jamaica. On this point, he said on his program, quote, "You can't on the one hand make a national hero out of Marcus Garvey, and no one in our history deserves this accolade more than Garvey, and on the other hand, suppress or ignore the philosophy of negritude, the dignity and beauty of blackness. That is the core and essence of Garvey's greatness. To do so is to make a sham of our national hero and to bludgeon the sensitivity of the majority of our people." This kind of public talk made enemies for Frank Hill. He received letters from listeners upset with him for drawing attention to race. The new Jamaica was for them a place where the shackles of the British past were left outside the stadium the moment when the new standard was unfurled. Race was a colonial matter that was folded and packed away with the Union Jack. What intellectuals like Frank Hill should be doing, they said, was talk and write about the greater problems of infrastructural development, Puerto Rican-style industrialization, education, and a new diplomacy with North America and the Latin American nations, not race, which would keep Jamaicans tethered to the oppression of those ugly centuries of slavery. Here's the words of one of the letter writers to Frank Hill, quote, "You appear to be looking through a pair of very, very dark glasses, almost black, in fact. It does seem that skin color and race and the social arrangements we have inherited are taking up far too much of your time when what I want is a clear way out." A prominent member of the Jamaican elite wrote a public letter calling Hill, quote, "a xenophobic racialist." Hill was amused by it, but not threatened. He took seriously his role and voice and continued to speak about the need for more, not less, recuperation of the African heritage, which was the greatest influence on Jamaican identity. "We've got to put aside these fears and illusions," he said in response to the criticism. "We've got to bring our great Jamaican qualities into the open, flaunt them, defend them, push them forwards, even aggressively, for they are what we are, as typical and authentic as rice and peas and ackee and saltfish. And they're distinctive enough to add something of value to the world's culture." Now, the force of the US civil rights movement infused the Jamaican conscience around race in a way that has been studied but not fully understood. The formal detachment from Britain emphasized in the migration ban and the opening of the US to Jamaican migrants from 1965, with the overturn of the restrictive McCarran Act and President Lyndon Johnson's revised Immigration and Nationality Act, made US migration appealing to Caribbeans and deepened the contact between Jamaica and the United States. Hill welcomed this. He believed there was nothing psychically useful left to be gained from a relationship with Britain. Geography and history, he said, meant Jamaica had to treat seriously with the United States for its future, and especially with the lessons on racial struggles in the US South that arrived on the front pages of the Jamaican papers. Writing in June 1965, the year, I should say, of the US invasion of the Dominican Republic, he concluded, quote, "When you look out into the world from where you sit, you see only 3 areas of economic and political power that are worth serious Jamaican attention: America, Russia, and Western Europe. Russia was too far, and Western Europe was, quote, creating their own world within their exclusive boundaries. There's no place for the West Indies in any part of it. That leaves us with America," end quote. But to figure out what that relationship meant in this new American order defined by Vietnam and Castro's revolution outside and urban violence inside was not easy. Hill searched for answers from close study of the civil rights leaders. In Dr. Martin Luther King, he found one possibility for this rethinking. He saw King's approach as strategic: address racial problems through legislation, then move on to wider domestic and foreign policy activism. When King visited Jamaica and spoke at the UWI in 1965, Frank Hill was there in the front row, listening and noting everything. Afterwards, he contemplated the lessons of King's approach. Here is what he said. There were two keynotes in King's inspiring speech. They are perspective and commitment. Perspective has to do with power, for perspective shows us the reality of economic and political power with which we have to live. But commitment has to do with values, with the quality of social compassion that commits us to a total involvement to win the struggles against poverty, racialism, and war, end quote. When King was assassinated 3 years later, Frank Hill delivered a short and moving tribute on air that encompassed King's legacy and the great cloud of violence that hung over everything and at all times in U.S. history. Martin Luther King belonged to Jamaica as much as his native America. He knew violence inspired by fear was an integral part of the he knew violence inspired by fear was an integral part of the deeply rooted traditions of the American way of life. And he challenged those traditions with his message of love. And now that challenge has been struck down by the darker impulses of the American spirit, end quote. It was a rising of the violence after the assassination of King that made Hill sympathetic to Black Power in the late 60s. Where his contemporaries in Jamaica saw Black Power as an external poison that would infect the nationalist movement by turning racial history into anger, Hill found in it something else, a forceful new idea in the painful search for Jamaican self-identity that had to be treated with and examined. Black Power shook the Caribbean in an important way for Frank Hill. It showed the cracks in the British model of governance in Jamaica and compelled the holders of power to reveal how they thought about Black history in the project of post-colonial nation-making. It was not enough to deny Jamaica's African heritage on an idealistic motto, out of many one people, which Hill was quick to note to his listeners was actually borrowed from the United States, or claims that having a Black Prime Minister in Hugh Shearer was a viable interpretation of Black Power when the institutions of the office were built on foreign models. This is what he said, quote, "Everyone in our part of the Caribbean plays his tone in a petty minor key. Everyone reacts rather than initiates, and innovation is a dirty word that provokes visions of rabid change in a community that serves its stability from following British precedent methodically," end quote. In 1964, he addressed this on his radio program by telling his audiences that even their use of a knife and fork was taught to them by the British. We were not meant to question it. When someone uses a spoon to eat, we denigrate them without thinking that the spoon may be more practical for the purpose. Black Power, if adapted correctly, could force Jamaicans to question these legacies and find in their language, customs, beliefs, and pastimes something of their historic selves. Black Power is an opportunity to change course. The way Hill chose to respond to the insistence of the young activists who aligned themselves with Black Power in Jamaica was to inspire more attention to Jamaica's history. This was a passionate matter for him. One of his contemporaries described Hill in the late 60s as a man, quote, entranced by Jamaica's past. And the veracity of the claim is evident in his writing and work. He insisted that the enslaved leaders who resisted slavery and were denounced during colonialism should be taught in schools and made national heroes. It is in Hill's approach to the past that so much of his thinking becomes clear. And it was what he did in this regard as historian, writer, thinker, and more important, through the power of his position as in what he called being a nationalist bureaucrat, as head of the National Trust, that he most shaped Jamaican culture as we know it today. As early as 1963, Hill started speaking and writing about making Paul Bogle a national hero. This is what he said, quote, "So we make a hero out of George William Gordon the martyr, all well and good. But what tribute do we pay to Paul Bogle, the true leader and organizer of the Morant Bay Rebellion? We must remedy our oversight," end quote. He went further. Hill pushed for Sam Sharp to be made a national hero, and he did this with great devotion. He studied the records of the Baptist War of 1831 to 32 and wrote long lectures on Sharp that he delivered in person and published in the papers throughout the 60s. It was not just a matter of replacing British figures with black faces. It removed another psychological vestige of British rule that would give future Jamaicans a greater chance to see and recognize themselves in their ancestors, their own story of their nationalism. Here's Hill's introduction to a 1963 lecture he gave on Sam Sharp, quote, Jamaicans have been brainwashed into believing that all progress in their long evolution to independence was engendered from outside our shores. More specifically, that great turning point in Jamaican history, the emancipation that converted the slave system into a system of free wage labor, was an exclusive act of humanitarians that had roots in Britain. This brainwashing is part of the colonial tradition that seeks to upgrade the metropolitan culture and, by implication, denigrate the efforts and struggles of the native peoples towards freedom, end quote. It was Frank Hill who led the project to establish shrines at the birthplace of Garvey, Bogle, and Sharp. It was Frank Hill who honored these figures with essays on the anniversaries of their birth, making it a point of duty to deliver what he learned to his island-wide audience on the radio. It was Frank Hill in his role at the National Trust who organized for Garvey's return to Jamaica from London and for statues of these leaders to be commissioned. It brought him fresh fire. One irate listener summed up the depth of the colonial mindset that Hill in his own way was trying to bend with a stern takedown. Why, he asked, was Frank Hill wasting his talents and time by looking at the past and not focusing on the future? Why not speak about water lock-offs and bad roads instead of campaigning for statues to honor criminals and murderers? None of this deterred him. He not only kept up the campaign of honoring the black leaders of the past, but argued for new research and archives on post-emancipation Jamaica, which was the period, he argued, when the modern form of colonial racism was shaped. The British, of course, he said, have left behind complete records of what they did here. But there was a need to build archival collections in Jamaica on the details of the lives of those prominent Jamaicans who steadily built up our society between 1838 and 1938, end quote. This renewed focus on history was the opening that Black Power presented in 1968. But the state only saw it as an attack, and the explosion of urban protests in 1968 that culminated with the banning of Walter Rodney in October and the military response against the students of the UWI stirred more reflections in Hill. He regarded the banning of Walter Rodney, which he spoke about at length over successive evenings on the radio, as another social rising that could transform Jamaica positively if correctly handled. The ban against Rodney was wrong. There had been no evidence of any intention on his part to create a revolution in Jamaica. Yet what was much more significant from Hill's view was the possibility of harnessing the potential for new direction that came out of the university toward a new model of post-colonial development that dismantled the omnipresent Babel Tower in their midst and put Jamaica on a path of studied self-discovery. This was a matter Hill took seriously. In 1964, he wrote, "We have to remember that we only inherited the principles we're living by today. We didn't originate them, and we understand them only dimly, if at all. But it is mainly in the university that those principles and values are being re-examined to explain for our benefit those that are valid as well as those that are valueless. This is so important a job that we must be always vigilant in defense of its academic freedom," end quote. The government's actions with the banning of Rodney, which triggered hostility towards foreigners and the university as a whole, undermined academic freedom. More importantly for Frank Hill, it neglected the opportunity raised by the protest. This is what he said on the radio when the dust settled. "Last week, 6 years after independence, a new historical watershed was established. It cost us 3 lives and £1 million in property damage. And so it is vital for us to draw the lessons, the right lessons, from the crisis that nearly overwhelmed us last week. The problem that capped it all is the problem of finding a secure, respected niche in which the Jamaican intellectual can rest comfortable as his base of service to his community," end quote. He kept in touch with the student situation and the activism of black conscious youth through his nephew and friend of Walter Rodney, the Garvey scholar Robert Hill, whose own role in 1968 to 69 was important in raising the question of black power at the national level through Robert Hill's work with the celebrated Abeng newspaper. Frank Hill spent the last decade of his life working through failing health. He was severely ill in 1969, had a stroke in 1975, then the greater one that claimed his life 5 years later. During that period, those last years of his life, he was working on a study of Jamaican political history that he didn't live to complete. He remained a regular feature in Jamaican national intellectual life through the hard years of the 1970s. He welcomed the election of Michael Manley in 1972 and Manley's early social reforms. He was invited by Manley to be the keynote speaker at the launch of Manley's Politics of Change, Manley's book in '74, and delivered a thoughtful commentary on the possibilities that the 1970s could fulfill the hopes of the generation of 1938. By the latter half of the 70s, however, he was disheartened by the brutal political violence that brought out the worst sides of Jamaica's post-colonial existence. He stopped taking Manley's phone calls, disappointed with the way ideology had become a weapon of suppression that confused Jamaica's larger mission of national self-assertion. It is easy to hear a sting of personal and generational hurt in one of Frank Hill's late commentaries that he gave in 1977. Quote, "I don't work by instinct like a political animal. Rather, I work by assembling painstakingly the facts that are known, then put them into logical places in the cycle of cause and effect, and finally deduce some tentative conclusions. One of them so far is the national identity crisis in our outward-looking society, imitative rather than indigenously originally creative. And after 15 years of independence, Jamaicans as a whole are still thrashing in a swamp in the search of a national identity." End quote. Frank Hill's death on June 10, 1980, came when the intellectual builders of a free Caribbean had seen so much of what they fought for crack under the strain of savage power struggles. 1980 was one of the most fateful years in modern Caribbean history, in which the transitions from the nationalism of the 30s to the raging divisions of the 70s took a collective and final exhale. Frank Hill died 3 months after Guyanese historian Elsa Gavaya died. 30 days after the brutal Eventide fire, the most wrenching moment in Jamaica's violent 70s. He died 3 days before the assassination of Walter Rodney in Guyana, 4 months before the blood-soaked 1980 general elections in Jamaica, and 11 months before the death of Bob Marley. All this puts the respectful words to Frank Hill issued the week of his passing into greater relief. A younger journalist, Terry Smith, who learned his trade from Hill, said that many Jamaicans, whether they knew it or not, had Frank Hill to thank for their understanding of their country. This is what he said, quote, "The highest honor that could be accorded this stalwart Jamaican is the sense of country he was able to impart to his fellow citizens over the years, and the flowering to that sense in many young Jamaicans today." End quote. One of the most poignant memories of Frank Hill was written by Frank Hill himself, and in many ways it is the greatest epitaph on his tremendous life. In a 1963 radio broadcast, he offered an insight into his motivations by going back to his youth. This is what he said. "My earliest recollection of my childhood was when I was 7 years old, and that was a long time ago. I remember reading a passage from the Old Testament, one of St. Paul's declarations. I carried that sentence in my head all these long years. St. Paul said, 'I chastise my body and bring it to subjection, lest I myself become a castaway.' These words have made me try to do a number of things since then, some of them so foolhardy that only my native grain of last-minute caution has saved me from disaster. There was a time that the colonial secretary called me up to his office and warned me that if I continued my writings for immediate self-government, and this was during the war that was being fought in the name of self-determination of all peoples, and I thought also included Jamaicans, well, if I didn't shut up, they'd have to put me behind barbed wire. So I jumped at the opportunity, and they put me behind barbed wire. And I haven't looked back since." End quote. Every story has a beginning, a moment of creation. Our relationship to the start, as descendants of the violences of colonialism and slavery, depends on how the past has been given to us. The facts are there, but what they mean, the significance they hold to our lives, is contingent on the analysis that we inherit, and it is too easy to relax ourselves in ossified tales of our becoming. The story of Caribbean decolonization, its symbols are learned by rote. Once exploited possessions remade in the tactile fabric of our flags, neatly uniformed children with shirts tucked in just right, singing anthems at morning assemblies, and the chiseled names of national forebears on the entrances of government buildings. What we do not remember is that the struggle for freedom as a complete thing was a complicated process of release and embrace. It was not completed in the 60s or the 70s and remains an open pain that we wince at but avoid so that we can survive. What people like Frank Hill did in making the present we take so often for granted was to remind us that our self-making can only be realized when we question everything, even what they taught us, to get to the why of everything. The Babel world that Frank Hill railed against is wider and noisier and more accessible than ever. We live in a time of fictionalized histories and artificial pasts, where the seductions of our age seed greater misunderstanding of the ages that we stand on. We struggle to assert relevance of our existence in spaces that are only now coming to think about decolonization, a much repeated term in the former capitals of empire these days, as to almost lose its relevance, as a stage toward improved humanity without asking why it matters to post-colonial people, or what might be learned from those who have been decolonizing since they were heaved off the slave ship. Societies and histories are what people make of them. At the moment of Jamaican independence, the new state, in its anxious search for a redeemed creation story, supported many tremendously creative projects. One of the grandest was sculptor Alvin Marriott's epic national monument, presented to the public for the first time as a work in progress in a special newspaper supplement that appeared on April 23, 1963. That week, Frank Hill visited Marriott in his studio as he worked on it and offered this comment to his listeners, quote, "I confess that only after I'd looked at the figures for a few minutes, I felt trickles of excitement running through my body. I got the same kind of thrilling tingle I experienced that night in August last year when the Union Jack came down and the National Stadium and our black, green and gold flag took its place. For in these figures, Alvin Marriott has caught the finest spirit of Jamaican youth facing the perils and responsibilities of independence," end quote. 300 nude bodies forming a tower on which stood the nude young couple stripped of colonial cover and awaiting the rays of a new country. Marriott's monument was never completed. The public recoiled at this image when it appeared in the paper, writing letters of strong and stern objection for a week after. They were offended by the nudity, disturbed by the mound of black bodies. The society found no reflection of itself in it. It is today almost forgotten completely, seen in passing on a board in the Norman Manley Airport, and it finds no place in any creation story of modern Jamaica that we learn and repeat today. Just like Frank Hill, just like so many others. It is the task of those of us who want to better understand our origins to seek out the stories of those who dared to think of something more for us and see the past in fullest color, to glance anew at the surviving images of their ideas and personalities that they left behind, so that we come to know a Jamaican, a Caribbean, a Black and African history that is so much more than we have been told. Walk good, my friends. Now, just before we move on, I know where it might be stressed for time, but I must just first say my own personal thanks to the George Padmore Institute for inviting me, especially my brethren Linton for giving the personal invitation to me last year, and I'm very pleased for that. The History Department at Queen Mary for hosting it, and Chris especially for all the logistic work that's been done in making this lecture possible. This lecture is dedicated to my dearest relative, Jean Barnes, who was Frank Hill's first daughter. Jean took the best qualities of her parents, Frank Hill and Monica Hill, and made something entirely original from them that became a massive inspiration to me, to my wife, Ishta, to her family, and to everyone who knew her. And this is in honor and in memory of Jean, who passed almost 2 years ago. Thank you.
Before we say thank you to Matthew, I should also mention, Chris thrust a note in my hand to remind you about this. It is important. There was some flyers that went around at the start, and if you don't have one, then I'll say it today, but they're about the George Padmore Institute there. The George Padmore Institute is a charity, and there's a QR code on there. So if you wanted to make a donation, it would of course be most welcome. If you don't have a flyer, I'm sure you can get hold of one or find a way to donate through their website, but please do if you are able to. Anyway, that's all from me, and let's extend our thanks to Professor Matthew J. Smith.